we are very, very fortunate to have some folks who have been not only thinking about this, but acting in the space of addressing and obtaining reparations for a long time. And so we're looking forward to what will be a policy, but a reality conversation too, because we know that policy without action is just flapping your gums, right? So we're gonna have an overview or framing of the conversation with Dr. Lionel Kimball, who leads our Research and Policy Center, and it will be followed by a panel of noted individuals that I will be honored to moderate. And so we're going to jump right in because we also will provide an opportunity for participation from our audience, and there will be questions, we know, and we hope that you will frame it as a question because I'm prepared to address that as well. But without further ado, let me bring up Dr. Lionel.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon. As Karen mentioned, my name is Lionel Kimball, and I'm the Executive Director of the Research and Policy Center for Chicago Urban League. And it is indeed a privilege to offer some context and articulate the driving purpose behind this report, as well as to reintroduce my esteemed President and CEO. The call for reparations has become a deeply rooted, multi-generational movement across the African diaspora, solidified as a tradition in the pursuit of justice and equity. At its core, the demand for reparations is founded on the unyielding conviction that individuals of African descent and their forebears deserve both compensation and a restoration of agency to protect against future injustices. This movement does more than recognize the forced labor of African ancestors whose coarse contributions laid the infrastructure of this nation. It also aims to honor their legacy with meaningful and actionable measures. Reparations represents a critical gesture of respect and redress for the descendants, many of whom continue to live with the consequences of systematic inequities, including the ongoing impact of the war on drugs, and reside in historically underserved areas such as Chicago's South Side. In 2020, the tragic police killing of George Floyd and the ongoing national protest for racial justice reignited discussions on reparations and emphasized the urgency of repairing the harms done to Black communities. Evanston, Illinois, led the nation as the first U.S. city to establish a reparations program specifically for Black residents, setting a precedent for other cities. Building on this momentum, officials from Chicago took steps to explore pathways for reparations to descendants of enslaved African Americans in the city. Notably, in early 2022, Illinois became the second of 3 U.S. states to establish a commission focused on reparations for African American descendants of slavery. In 2021, the Chicago Urban League received funding from the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority through its Restore, Reinvest, Renew, or R3 initiative to advance community-led research on reparations. In response, our Research and Policy Center convened a planning committee of community members from 10 Southside neighborhoods designated by the ICJAI as R3 zones. This committee took on the critical task of defining what they call community reparations specific to those areas and creating a framework for implementing such reparations. Their focus was to address the harm inflicted on the South Side communities through past government policies, particularly the war on drugs, and prioritize ICJI's 5 areas of concern: civil and legal aid, economic development, reentry, youth development, and violence prevention. Our committee's research concentrated on 10 predominantly Black Southside neighborhoods: Douglas, Oakland, Grand Boulevard, Fuller Park, Washington Park, Woodlawn, South Shore, Greater Grand Crossing, Inglewood, and West Inglewood. Through a comprehensive survey, the team assessed the urgent needs of these communities and evaluated how reparation actions could impact the South Side. From 2021 to 2022, they engaged over 200 residents through extensive interviews, surveys, and community discussions. This work provided a nuanced view of community concerns about reparations and helped identify specific needs and priorities of Southside residents. While the initial intent of this project was to explore how reparations could be broadly transform communities, their findings ultimately suggest that reparations may be best serve individuals directly impacted by the systematic injustices. Today's discussion will unpack these findings, offering valuable insights into the hopes and aspirations of Southside residents for the community and helping shape a way forward toward a broader discourse on reparations. In addition, our panelists will discuss the state of the current fight for reparations in our city and explore various recommendations and policy initiatives to achieve reparations in our location. This concludes my comments, and it is a pleasure of mine to reintroduce my president and CEO, Karen Freeman Wilson, to the stage, who will introduce and moderate today's discussion.
Thank you, Lionel. Can everybody hear okay?
Yeah.
Maybe it's my hearing then. Well, I want to call our panelists up. Jillian Giles, who was one of the research contributors, Kiera Hardin, who was also a research contributor. Come on up, have a seat. Caitlin Johnson, who is the executive director of the Black Roots Alliance. Yumi Grigsby, or Mayumi Grigsby, who is the chief of policy for the city of Chicago. Cam Howard, and I have to affectionately refer to him as an OG in this, that's right, who is the director of Reparations United. And then Marvin Slaughter, who is the board chair of the African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission for the state of Illinois. Please welcome our panelists. So, testing. All right, can you all hear me okay? Before we jump into our panel, our alderman is here. Please give a rounding applause to Alderman Haddow. Slipping in, but we thank you for coming here today. So I could spend probably 5 or 10 or 20 minutes introducing any one of you. I have intentionally not done that because I really want to spend conversation in talking about the report and really what it means and the work that is ongoing and has been happening. I also want to say that while this is framed as something that is for benefit of the South Side, because that's how our refunding happened, this is, this does sound better. It sounded better, and I wasn't sure, but it does. But I wanted to really note at the outset that this is not something that is particular to the South Side or the West Side or any side of town. It is particular to a people, right? And that is not just for Chicago, that's for all over. But we're talking about the South Side in the report because our R3 funding was particular for areas of town. And then I want to place this in the context of the fact that while the original grant was written regarding the war on drugs, because that's what R3 is designed to address, we understand reparations to be something that is much more global. And while I'm sure we'll get a history lesson from a number of you, we're talking about the harm, repairing the harm that was created by the institution of slavery. And we know that the war on drugs is a byproduct of that institution. So let's just be clear about that. So let's jump right in after that historical context. I want to talk about the context of activism in Chicago around reparations, because this isn't new to Chicago. It's certainly not new to our country. I think that it has risen and fallen in terms of a topic of conversation, but the fight for reparations has a long-standing history in this community. So I want to ask particularly, and this is directed to Cam and Caitlin and Marvin, and I hope you don't mind me using your first name, because I want y'all to call me Karen. Would you talk about the history of reparations in this community?
Sure, I guess I can start. Tessie. So Chicago has a long history of reparations, not only on the national level, going back to the Nation of Islam's 10-point platform, the Black Panther Party's 10-point platform, all including reparations. But when it comes to local reparations, Chicago was also the leader. It was the first city, the former alderman of this same particular ward, Alderman Dorothy Tillman, led an initiative in Chicago to have corporations and other institutions that were complicit in the enslavement of our ancestors to have to file slave disclosure ordinances. Chicago was the first city, Massachusetts was the first state, then Chicago was the first city, and subsequently, maybe about 2 dozen cities and states also filed slave disclosure ordinances. As a fact, the Chicago ordinance is still in the books, and COBRA led an action several years ago around and utilized that ordinance. But in 2001 was really the beginning of the local reparations efforts in the country. You can fast forward to 2005 in the city. The federal court had the major case that decided that we didn't have standing to bring a lawsuit. That case was held here in Chicago in 2005, packed the courtroom for that. 2015, we know about the John Burge torture trial and the reparations that were the result of that, the first in the nation. Again, Chicago leading the way. 2016, there was a Chicago visit of the Working Group of Experts for people of African descent from the United Nations. And from that organizing that we did, the United Nations declared, having came to Chicago, that the United States owed Black people in this country reparations, but that was a Chicago effort as well. Fast forward 2019, Dr. Willie Wilson, philanthropist, businessman, was looking at the debates of the election, and reparations came up. And so he called a meeting on Southside Church and said, we want to do local reparations in the city of Chicago. And he brought forth Alderman Robert Sawyer, State Senator Matty Hunter, and State Representative Will Burns to introduce legislation. From that effort, and I was the lead writer of that legislation, from that effort, we got the Chicago Reparations Subcommittee, and we got the Illinois African Descendant Reparations Commission. Contrary to what was stated earlier, Illinois was not the second state to have a reparations commission. Illinois was actually the first state. Dr. Conrad Worrell of the Center for Institute Studies, along with State Senator Matty Hunter and others, passed, Governor Blagojevich was the governor, passed State Reparations Commission, Illinois Transatlantic Reparations Commission in 2004. So our history in the reparations movement, this city is big for providing leadership, and we hope that as a result of this report and as a result of what's going on with the city and with the state, we'll continue to offer national leadership.
Thank you for that. Kate, did you want to talk about the history or That was pretty comprehensive.
I was decades. I can share a little bit more about like how a lot of local activists and kind of we're standing on their shoulders.
Yes.
There's so much wisdom and practice and intentionality that has been built into reparations conversations over the years, that many activists are continuing to move that conversation forward and recognizing, to what you mentioned about the war on drugs, there are formerly incarcerated people who are working with a group called Equity and Transformation to actually demand reparations for the war on drugs as well because of its root in anti-Blackness and racism and because of its connection to slavery.
Yes.
But also recognizing this is a conversation that involves all Black people. And so there are organizations like Black Rights Alliance who have been going door to door talking with Black people about what could reparations mean to them, to their families, but also how do we begin to have increasingly larger conversations so that the community as a whole can begin to see what are the ways that we're hurting and what is the opposite of that? How do we have the imagination to chart our own healing and also name the corporations and other entities that have caused the harm? And I think all of that is really rooted in understanding that we didn't pop out of the sky. We really were immersed in a collective consciousness that was really talking about how we could repair harm.
Absolutely, and that is really the root of reparations, to repair. I'm coming to you next, Marvin, because I want to get some state context, but you talked about the ordinance, the state, city ordinance, and Cam raised the city ordinance in the context of the work of Alderman Tillman. In the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, there are a number of displays that talk about the corporate connection to reparations and how corporations that are still in existence today benefited from that institution. Marvin, would you talk a bit about what the state commission is doing and the sort of the origin of that state commission?
Yes, of course. Testing. Also? Yeah, so to provide a little bit of background on the beginnings of the commission, the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, Circuit A 2021, embarked on a pretty ambitious plan to dismantle systemic racism in Illinois following the murder of dear brother George Floyd. The caucus introduced legislation to reform 4 key pillars of government in the creation of the Illinois African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission, grew out of the economic opportunity pillar. The ADCRC, as it is known amongst most individuals who are supporters, has been tasked with developing and recommending measures to ensure equity, equality, and parity for African American descendants of child slavery. In addition to that, it is also tasked with the creation of the Slavery Era Disclosure Bill, creation and enforcement of the Slavery Era Disclosure Bill. It is tasked with creating policies that will ensure equity and parity in African American neighborhoods and the preservation of African American neighborhoods. Also in creating a vocational training center for people of African descent to begin to level the playing field when it comes to trades and workforce development for individuals who are descendants of U.S. child slavery, as well as other things. And other things is the big piece of the scope, right? We're tasked with being able to recommend policies that ensure equity, equality, and parity for all African American descendants of child slavery here in Illinois. So a lot of things fall under that bucket as well.
Thank you for that. So let's talk about the report a bit, because the report really explores how residents, everyday people, right, those who have not necessarily been engaged in the daily advocacy around reparations. It talks about how they envision reparations and what they would like to see. I want to go to Jillian and ask you to kind of, how would you summarize the findings? What did you see? Were you surprised by anything?
Yes. So I came into the report early, and it was led by Naomi Johnson, who couldn't be here today, as well as Kiara. In terms of the findings of the report, I would say we went into the report with the expectation that we would be able to use the R3 funds as a means for reparations. And then as we actually talked to people, as we conducted the research, as we distributed the surveys, we learned that reparations, in order to honor the community, would have to be more than what the R3 fund could provide. It would have to encompass being able to give people, individual people, reparations. And the R3 fund scope is really centered towards giving funding towards community-based organizations that are located in the 10 community areas. And so I think one of the biggest findings of the report is that as we continue to consider what reparations could look like, we do have to have this balance of providing resources through community-based organizations, as well as continuing the spirit of giving individual people money and support and services that they may need as they so dictate. I'll pass it to Kiara to see.
I think you did a great job.
So, Kiara, I want your take on it, because, you were one of the day ones.
Yeah.
And I want you to talk about any notable conversations that you all held as a result of it, that you might remember.
Yeah, I think all of the conversations were notable. I love to say everything is political because everything is literally political, but people may not understand how policy plays into like the situation or the issue that they may have. And so for me, one of the things that stood out when doing like key informant interviews and like, in particularly, we did a photo voice where people go out into the community and take pictures, and then they respond with or reply with like how that picture, vibe with them or what they see when they look at that picture, and then they talk about like what non-traditional or people who do not live in that neighborhood will see. And then they talk about the nuances and the differences and why, it looks like that. And I think that for me, it's very, like, what stood out is that, like, a lot of people said the same things. So it's like people know what they need in their community and they know, like, the avenues to take it, but it's like we just need that final push of, like, the government officials and, like, the people who have the money to actually put it into the community.
Thank you for that. I want to just ask, and this is something for everyone, because there is I won't say a debate, but there is a context of community versus individual reparations. And when you think about the impact of slavery and everything that has grown out of slavery as impacting individuals, but it's also impacted communities. So I'm gonna start with Yumi and ask, how have you thought about this, particularly as the city embarks on their work as it relates to reparations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. So I'm originally Liberian, and part of my family settled in Liberia as part of Marcus Garvey's advocacy around, having a place for freed slaves to return. And the other half of my family is, African Liberian from before it was Liberia. And so I think about, this idea of what the global is versus what the individual is, and the individual experiences of, say, American descendants of slaves versus, people who suffered from colonialism. As the city, I think, obviously my colleague Carla Coupe, who's the Chief Equity Officer, is embarking on this journey both with community and with elected officials in terms of establishing the Reparations Task Force and how they move forward. As the Chief of Policy, when I think of policy for all of the city of Chicago, we really think about our mission being both to repair past harms and to invest in policies that lead to systemic change. So when we think about that idea of the individual versus the community, we do think about the reason that a lot of individuals in certain communities are impacted the way that they are is because of decisions that have been made by the state, policies that have been, implemented by the state, historic disinvestment, segregation, and you can look at that when you look across, the different areas that Kiara and Jillian lifted up in the report. When you look at health, when you look at incarceration, when you look at all of those different areas, you really think there is the disparities are very stark in the city of Chicago when you look at zip codes, right? And so when we look at the policies that we are implementing, we really think about targeted universalism, or we think about, the curb cut theory, which is that if we're investing in people who are the most negatively impacted by those policies, and, then what we're doing is actually lifting up policies that can benefit everyone. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's how we think about it.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. Cam, I'd love to hear what your thinking is as well, because I know you've thought a lot about it. Is it a check to an individual? Is it investment in community? Is it both? How does that happen? Everybody wants to talk about the national debt. So what do you think?
So we believe it's both, what we call direct benefits and community benefits. So reparations have to do both. When it comes to how we see that will look, we look at the international standard for reparations. It's a global standard. I wrote that standard into the federal legislation. When I was recrafting the federal legislation, I wrote the standard in both the city and state legislation. And that standard is that reparations, I wrote a piece called Laying the Foundation of Local Reparations, and stated that at the local level, what we're doing is basically triage. What are the most important issues that a particular location is facing, and direct those resources at that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 issues. It's not going to be where we're going to do these massive programs at the local level. Resources are simply not there. For instance, in Evanston, 3 years, one program, $5 million has been distributed. And so we can see even from the first initiative that it's really important that we really determine how we're going to spend these money, whatever dollars we get. Now, Illinois and Chicago has much more resources than Evanston, but at the same token, we have to be clear that our resources are limited, and we want to do and target them in the direction that's going to have the most meaningful effect on our communities. So those 5 areas of repair on the international level is cessation and assurances and guarantees of non-repetition. You have to stop the bad acts if they continue to act. Restitution can be community grants, educational grants, business grants, things of that nature. Compensation, we look at repair the basic income, or even just the basic income. That's something that can go directly. That's a direct benefit. But also satisfaction, apologies, commitments to our cultural institutions, museums, markers, and things of that nature, and then rehabilitation. The health profile in this city is horrendous for Black people. And we have to have institutional change to address the health profile, as well as direct services. So it's a combination of both community benefits and individual benefits.
Thank you for that. Marvin, how have you all thought about it? And I know that the state has been conducting a number of hearings. How have you all started to think about what that should be, or what reparations should look like in the state of Illinois?
Yeah, so when we talk about the conversation around reparations, we have to understand what are we repairing from. And it all draws back to slavery, right? So we have to understand and ground the work and the harm that were inflicted upon those who experienced directly slavery and their descendants who experienced things like Jim Crow, redlining, et cetera, et cetera. So we think it's both. It has to be both individual and it has to be systemic or institutional, as we like to describe it. So we want to deal with making sure that individuals can seek employment and that they're being employed at equitable rates. We want to make sure that we're ensuring equity, equality, and parity in state contracting. But then that also means that we have to make sure that there are businesses to be able to take the contracts that the state is doling out. When we look at the different disparity reports that talk about the types of businesses that all Black people typically have, we are not really in things like database management. So you're missing out on billions of dollars in contracts that go to individuals that can do database management. So we now have to think about how do we, as a state, create incentives? How do we create programs that will allow for us to be able to build that base so then those contracts can actually be rolled out to individuals, right? We think about things like cash payments. We hear it all the time when we go around the state, the cash is needed. Cash payments are necessary. And as we think about all of these different disparities, we always try to tie back anything that we end up recommending is going to have to be tied to a harm that was experienced by that community, by those individuals. So we look at redlining and we think, okay, how exactly do we improve home ownership in the descendant community? Does that look like housing vouchers? Does it look like giving individuals who are descendants of slaves some form of equity to be able to go out and purchase homes, to be able to improve home ownership? When we look at education, does that mean specific educational scholarships and grants for those individuals who are descendants of child slavery? So again, that they can experience that upward social mobility, right? What are those types of programs that we can set up in place to allow for individuals to be able to experience a level of self-autonomy and self-determinism?
So Caitlin, the Black Roots Alliance, you talked about how you all have been going door to door, how you've talked to residents of the community. In those conversations, do you see a nexus between what Marvin has just described and what residents think about when they think about reparations?
Absolutely. I think one of the things we realized is true is that there is no system outside ourselves. There is no community without the individual. So it's always an intertwined, interdependent experience when you look at kind of the macro and the micro of it all. But one of the things we found is through something that we call policy design circles in partnership with another organization called Liberation in a Generation, we wanted to really crack open the imagination and move from this perceived scarcity in some ways and recognizing that their budgets are moral documents. People are making choices about what to invest in, and recognizing Black communities are always the ones that somehow don't get that choice made for them. We don't have the long-term investments. And so in a world where, in a future where reparations is real, we did this Afrofuturist exercise where we gave people something called an artifact, which was like an app or a magazine that was allowed them to immerse themselves in a future where reparations was real and they could unpack the different components. So with the app, what do we talk about when we need compensation? Is there a number that actually would change your life? Is this too much? Is this too little? Do you like that the government takes it first? Does it have to do anything with child support? And all of the things that many Black people have to think about when it comes to money. We had an opportunity to explore that with folks on the South and West sides. But also to Cam's point as well, all the health and other issues that come into the consequences of being Black in America, the post-slave syndrome and all of that. What does it look like to have access to free or affordable and healthy food? How do we think about housing? How do we think about all of the areas of our lives that are informed by a Black experience, that have been harmed by chattel slavery and all of the systemic anti-Blackness that has come from it, from redlining, from the war on drugs, from inequitable education outcomes? All of these things create this myriad experience of harm that we can think beyond. And so what we found through the door-to-door is we've canvassed thousands of folks door-to-door and have had interviews with some 200 people in depth to really get at what would reparations mean to you? What are the things that your family is hurting? And are they connected to your experience of being Black in America? And if the answer is so, what is the opposite of that? What we found is people know what they need. And that was also true in the report. People very clearly, like, well, if you ask us what we need, we can tell you. But so many decisions get made without asking first. And so our organization, like, we want to ask the questions first. And we don't necessarily have, like, reparations should be A, B, C, or D, but we believe it should be informed by the people who are experiencing the harm and have the most to lose if we don't win on this, but also have the most to gain and the biggest transformation, and being able to have that rising tide lift all ships. That's what really matters, and being able to see reparations as a vehicle to that transformation.
So I see you shaking your head, Kiara. Would you talk a little bit about that? And what strikes me is that this policy discussion is very much one that almost screams you have to consult with the community about this.
Yeah, for sure. I feel that, well, not I feel, but like the experience that I've had when, so my role in this project was really like the project manager or the organizer of it. So like all of the key informant interviews, like I found people and like we'll organize the interviews, so like Julian or like some of our other colleagues or counterparts can do them. I facilitated the photo voice and some of the word cafes. I was going to say conversations, but it's word cafes that we had and the different other metrics that we use. But generally speaking, I think that the consensus was like people know what's going on. People can identify like that when you go to the north side, like it looks vastly different. Like, and we say that Hyde Park is walkable, but when you go to Lincoln Park, the walkability is very vastly different, right? Like, there's no grocery stores that I can walk to. I live in Washington Park, and so just considering that within itself, I think that everything that Caitlin said was accurate.
So let's talk for a moment about this. We're using the language of healing, of repair, of harm. And so we know that reparations is laid out to help individuals who have been harmed by intentional, institutional policies, right? And certain actions. What about those folks who say, but I didn't do that? It wasn't me, and I didn't have any slaves, or I didn't participate in those policies. What do you say to that? Whoever wants to jump in.
I think, and then I'm gonna leave it to the experts. But for me, personally, I think that if you benefited from, even if it wasn't you personally, there was a benefit because it is a system, it is systematic. The laws that are in place are set up for you to benefit and for me to fail. That's how capitalism works, right? It's at the demise of like the environment and Black people, real people of color. And so like, yeah, I'm gonna just leave it there and go ahead, experts.
And I'm not one of the experts. I just want to say that first. But I think that's what I was saying earlier when I talked about target universalism and talked about the fact that when we design our policies, we think about how is this helping everyone. So as an example, Caitlin talked about the access to grocery stores, right? And so we were thinking about how do we lean into this idea of what can the city do to meet that need to increase access to food. We know where there lacks access. We know that the stark difference between, the South Side and, Lincoln Park in terms of access to food. So we're leaning into this idea of a municipally owned grocery store and seeing how the city can lean in and do what the city does best so that we can have a grocery store, but also one that is culturally competent and meets the needs of the people in the community. When we think about, access to financial institutions, we look at the data, and we have members of my team here. So we have Noreen Hashim Jawani, we have Matthew Swalek, we have Grace Gunn, and Matthew has really led on this research around where people don't have access to financial institutions that actually build wealth, where there's an abundance of check cashing places where you have to pay 12% of your check in order to get the actual paycheck. So we're looking into how do we do public-private partnerships so that we can increase access to full-service financial institutions that will actually allow people to build wealth in areas that are lacking access, like Inglewood, like other places that we've seen that the ratio in some places is 0. And so it's when we think about it, and we think about it in terms of how are you repairing while you're also investing in systemic change, that really will lead to expanding the tax base, expanding, the building, closing the racial wealth gap, and then building community wealth. Then those are ways that we can talk about how the policies that we're doing, even though we're doing it with the perspective of how are we centering people who are the most negatively impacted, this is how it benefits all of us as a community.
I remember interviewing so many people. One of the questions that we asked people was, if you had $1 billion, what would you do with it? And we used that question to help them open their minds to what reparations could look like. We talk about community in one of the previous questions. A lot of people in these community areas had lived in these community areas, but had lived in areas all across the South Side. And a lot of the common denominators that we talk about is like things like empty lots and like just wanting things like youth centers and programs and like mental health care. And these housing, food. And these are things that, when we talk about the legacy of slavery, people who have not had that experience, I just feel like their priorities tend to be different, When we look at like these community areas and then also communities outside of the 10 community areas in the South and West Side, and then thinking about people as well, there are just stark differences. And so when we think about the question of like, I didn't do this or I wasn't quite responsible for this, you see who benefits and who has not benefited historically, currently, both in the people and the land. And the people and the land are important because although the R3 fund is specific to specific community areas, people migrate. And so it's important that, and I think also in the concept of reparations are for individuals, it's important that we both invest in our communities, like the physical and the physical people that live in the communities, because things shift.
I would start by saying there's a difference between what good government should do and what is reparative in nature. When we have the conversation of reparations, it all flows from the heart. Now, there are things that good government should do. There should be great schools in every neighborhood. There should be infrastructure invested in every neighborhood. Those aren't reparative things. Those are expectations of what a functioning government should be providing. Now, when we have a conversation on reparations and individuals talking about they feel as though they don't owe, or they weren't beneficiaries of slavery, in the same way that the harms were transferable to those who are descendants of chattel slavery, you see it in epigenetics, you literally see it in DNA. So are the benefits of individuals who chose to come to this country and to take on American citizenship. That's what it means to take on citizenship. You take on both the benefits and you take on the costs. I think this conversation sometimes misses, though, the cost to who? And that's the identification of the community that we're talking about. Everybody talks about descendants of chattel slavery. Well, how many individuals, if you raise your hands, can say that they're a descendant of chattel slavery?
I got 2 hands.
There we go. But if you look at data doesn't bear that out. Data only shows African American or Black. So this conversation becomes an all Black people conversation when it actually, yes, there are some disparities that other individuals who are Black experience, but they never experience the direct harm. So it makes the solutions that we propose for both of those different communities vastly different.
I'm going to look at it from a different perspective. In 2001, there was a World Conference Against Racism that was held in Durban, South Africa. The outcome document of that conference was a game changer. It changed the whole reparations strategy from advocating to enforcement. We had passed advocating, now we're in an enforcement phase. And what I mean by that is that at Durban, the global community declared that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity, that enslavement was a crime against humanity, that apartheid was a crime against humanity. And we felt apartheid here was called Jim Crow, but it was apartheid, were crimes against humanity. As crimes against humanity, these are the most egregious crimes that a government can commit against the civilian population. Talking about policy and actions. These were policies and actions of the federal government. Criminal policies and action that had detrimental effects on people of African descent. And we're feeling those same effects today. Crimes against humanity do not have a statute of limitations. So if it happened 400 years ago, and the entity that produced those crimes or engaged in those crimes still exists today, this government still exists. The 13 colonies were the predecessor governments of the United States government. So they're responsible for the predecessor colonies' actions. If crimes were committed, and we know they are, and there's continued impact, and we're living that continued impact, then every civilized nation has an obligation, it's no longer a question. It's a legal and moral obligation to address and to redress those crimes. So when people say, we weren't here, so we're not responsible. You live in a civilized state, then there's no question of whether or not redress must take place. You just have to do so, or just move somewhere else. But as long as you live in a so-called civilized state at this particular time, then redress is mandatory for crimes against humanity.
So that context really does give us a level set, if you will, to then begin to redress. But even, I would say, if you look at the institutions that were created, I mean, there was an intentionality about how you subjugate people, how you ensure that there was this superiority and this inferiority, how that was really enforced by slave codes, by a police state during slavery, which has continued to this day, and how the violence that began even prior, during the transatlantic slave trade is what we're seeing in the violence today. So to say that I didn't do it, but you benefited from it, you really can't. It's hard to make that argument. I mean, anybody can make any argument, but it's hard to sustain the argument. So let's talk about what does that mean in actual policy, because there's some policy recommendations in the report, but there are also policies that folks are working on. There is federal legislation, there's state legislation, there's a city ordinance. What does that mean in terms of getting things done?
One thing that comes to mind for me is you mentioned intentionality. The level of intentionality and intensity with which Black people have been subjugated is the same level of intensity and intentionality that we need our repair to come in. If it happened at the federal level, we can even talk about the imperial level. Like, there's an empire that is bigger than all of us that was built off the backs of enslaved people. So if everything was intentional, which we know it was, laws were created for specific purposes, they're perpetuated by specific ideals, flipping that on its head and being like, how can we be that intense and that intentional to have harm that both heals the system of the expression of this, but also the individuals who make up the system. Making sure that it's rooted in the lived experience of the people who both have the historical connection to the harm, but who are also in the day-to-day mire of the harm as well. I think honoring that people have multiple identities and recognizing that we're all not just Black people, recognizing every person is an intersection of identities. How do we actually recognize that intersectional harm as well? Because that tells the entire story of our people and tells the entire story of communities as well. And so I think whatever policies become realized, if they're done in a way that is rooted in true civic engagement, true community information, truly being led and designed by people who are experienced with the harm and with the ideas of healing and solutions, I think we'll get closer to being able to actually have a system-wide repair.
Thank you for that. Others, I mean, where do we go? And talk a bit about the policy recommendations even in the report.
Oh no, I'm gonna let Kiara go first. I think we both have things to say about the policy in the report though.
Yeah. So, as we know, that the R3 funds there was a goal specifically for R3 funds, right? And they were supposed to go to specific places and organizations through that, right? So I find that while we have recommendations and we do, they're very limited to which the circumstances in which we had, right? So we wouldn't preference the conversation. I do think that when thinking about, I'm gonna tell y'all a story and then I think that it'll help me get to my point. So my granddaddy, he was a sharecropper, right? And he participated in the Great Migration. And then 2 years later, he sent for my grandma, who had my 2-year-old mom. And that's how I came to be in Chicago, right? Who paid? The thought process that I have here is who paid for the travel from where, during the Great Migration, right? It was all self-funded from people who had no money. So that's what that within itself is how do we begin to, identify and repair, all of the things that came with that. And I don't necessarily, the recommendations that we have are great for what they are, but they also are not true in the sense of how do we actually begin to develop the reparations in Chicago, right? Because they're limited to what R3 could do. So yeah.
So would it be fair to say then we need a set of recommendations that are not limited by the scope of the funding that allowed us to do this report?
Correct.
Okay. That's fair.
Was my story helpful?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kiara. I feel like people's imaginations and dreams for reparations far exceeded the limitations of the R3 funds. That being said, I think the work that the R3 fund can do to center Black people in a way that honors reparations is still worth talking about.
Yes.
Really thinking about things like civil legal aid. A lot of people, when we interviewed them, they had no idea where to even access that resource or what it was. When we talk about,
Would you talk about that for people who may be listening, who may be here, who don't really know about civil legal aid?
So civil legal aid really is focused on issues that would have to do with civil matters like housing, eviction, things like
hospital
that,
debt,
hospital beds.
things like that.
Exactly. And in regards to other things, there were things like a public banking option that people had talked about that could be supportive for community economic development. The point that I was trying to make, though, is within the limitations of the R3 fund and the orientation of it, there are ways of which we can center Black people and center folks in the community to give them what they need. I don't feel like it's the end of the conversation with reparations, but I feel like it can be the start, exactly, be the start of things. Because these resources and this funding is real. And there were things like asking just for like community centers and programs for youth, where we can kind of start things and get this momentum going until we're able to get funding streams and other ways of which we can source reparations in the ways of which people are imagining.
I did want to note though that like the housing component of this is very, I appreciate like giving money towards housing is always a good thing, especially where we are in like today's society. And I do think that the recommendations around like supplementing that through some of these program things were helpful.
Thank you for that.
Yes.
Both of you, Yumi?
Yes, I was going to say that one of the reasons that we started to lean into this idea of public options, which we call the pathway to access and empowerment, is that we started to think about the fact that I think over the last 10 years, I think 10% of the Black population has left the city of Chicago, and started to look into the reasons why, right? And then for us, we define public options as how does the city lean in a way that the city can do what it does best? So convene all of the different sectors to look at the most historical challenges or the challenges facing the residents. And so we started to think, and I already talked about financial institutions. I already talked about this idea of food access. But then we also were thinking about the possibilities of how do we use that to look at access, increasing access to pharmacies on the south and west sides. How do we think about community health outposts? How do we think about it in terms of immediate interventions, which is why we, in the report, you talk about guaranteed basic income. So in our ARPA relaunch earlier this year, we will be relaunching the guaranteed basic income we've invested.
About individual Black people receiving money and what they're going to do with it. We see these stories with young people lining up at Louis Vuitton or other things. We have to be very, very, very careful not to pigeonhole young people, Black people off of individual stories when we are a full community. I talk to so many young people who just want to be able to pay for food, just want to be able to pay for therapy, and have the resources that they need to be well. And we need to prioritize that. Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer that two things can be true. So like you can teach people how to invest, but like if all I'm doing is investing my money and I'm not enjoying it, what like life is meant to be lived, you know what I mean? So you know what I mean? Two things can be true at once. Like so I can receive a payment and go out and buy whatever.
I take home dinners, but everyone's looking at what's in her cart, right? And trying to police, if she's buying something that isn't that costs more money, and it's in a way that we're not looking at other people. I mean, I think if we broke down the data around how many people were committing fraud with PPP loans, we might be surprised that it's not just this idea of, oh, we gave unrestricted cash to people who happen to look a certain way and therefore they misused it. So I think it's two things. I think one, the data shows that people, when they have unrestricted cash, are using it for, for bills, or using it for mental health, or using it for education and other things. But I think it's also that there's this obsession a lot of times in terms of like, what are Black people spending their money on? That I think skews our ideas and our perspectives around what they deserve.
Kim, I just want to ask you to take on the question of how do you convince the folks who are decision makers, appropriators, those who have to provide the reparations, whether you're talking public or private, how do you convince them that this is something that is important?
First is, I have to go back to the aspect that these are criminal acts that have taking place. And so as long as they're upholding the system, they're upholding the criminal system. So we need to get America right. And getting America right begins with redress for people back in the South. Secondly, we have more and more research that is coming out that shows that paying reparations to Black Americans benefits in social areas. For instance, there was a report by Citibank that stated that they would have paid reparations 15 years ago, it would have put $15 to $20 trillion into the economy. It would increase the GDP 0.3% annually. So this is a benefit to all of America, and it would put hundreds of billions of dollars into the tax system. And so we can begin to talk about how repair to our community, others benefit from. And we have a tremendous history on collective economics in this country. So we're talking about we're going to spend all our money frivolously. We built Black towns with pennies. We had penny banks and nickel banks. My sister talked about we self-funded our migration.
Yes.
I mean, we have this history we can go back and we'll rely on, and we'll do better and greater things in the future as a result of this.
Thank you for that. So there's an economic argument. I'm gonna go to my far left and then I'm gonna come right in front.
Yeah, I just wanted to, so Rail's question, I wanted to back him up a little bit, only because.
So wait a minute. It doesn't sound like the question's coming. So I really need to think about it for 1 minute and then bring the question.
There's a perception of these things, right? That we will misuse money, and I think
Speak a little louder, please,
there's a
sir.
perception.
Do we have another, I was gonna ask about it earlier. Thank you for reminding me of that. Audience of.
Do any of the panelists believe that there is a need to put a fairly healthy series of fail-safes in place if there is a reparations opportunity in order to gain broad enough support for wholesale reparations in order to just to gain the support necessary in order to get broader and broader support for reparations as well.
So do we need to address the perception, even if it's wrong, with some kind of fail-safes? Caitlin, I saw you grabbing.
We talk about this a lot. We've heard this, a lot of times. There is this perception, but also recognizing that reparations and there's a fundamental principle of self-determination that comes with that. But we don't ask white people what they do with their money. So I personally am tired of having to defend Black humanity in any way, shape, or form. So I'm actually not interested in trying to convince people that I'm human. I am entitled to my humanity. I'm entitled to self-determination, and that's kind of the end of that for me.
So I get that. I wanna stay with you for a minute, and I agree with you 100%.
Right.
But at the end of the day,
Right.
the folks who have to vote
Exactly.
on that, whether you're talking about in the boardroom, or whether you're talking about in the State House, or whether you're talking about in City Hall, may not. So how do you get them to that?
If they don't think that I'm human, there's a vote that's coming up, and we could always vote differently.
That's the piece. So you vote them out of office.
Correct.
Okay. All right. And what about because here's the other thing. We're talking about this in the context of government, right? But how do you get the foundations of the world and the corporations of the world? Because in order for, I think, reparations to be at scale, in order to get the scale,
Right.
it's going to have to be more than government.
Just a quick
Marvin.
address that part of the question. Maybe I'm naive, maybe it's youth, but I believe that data is true. And that I present individuals who have a brain and a conscience, a God-breathed conscience, that if I present them truth, and I present them the butt-naked truth versus the dressed-up lie, they'll be able to choose between the two and choose the truth. Which is why I believe that evidence and data is so important. It is, making those economic arguments that there are positive externalities to giving poor people money. Okay, we understand that Black individuals who are descendants of child slavery happen to be some of the most impoverished individuals. So giving them money would honestly have amazing impact. So we start there and we keep going.
I believe that we really live in an age of propaganda and misinformation, but I really believe that reports like this and continuing to tell the truth will change things very firmly. I know it can be really hard when we see so much propaganda around reparations, but as we continue to tell the truth, continue to support each other and support people who are doing really good work, like everybody up on this panel, it's just going to grow, and it's been growing for hundreds of years, to the point where even like having conversations like this, like as a kid, like I don't even think I could have imagined like having a conversation about like actually implementing state level reparations or being a part of this type of research at all. And the fact that I'm able to do this now is such a privilege and honestly beyond my wildest dreams. So we will continue to persist and create a form of reparations, many forms of reparations. Somebody had talked about what's the timeline. We're going to be in this timeline of creating reparations for a while because the harm hasn't ended. We're going to be doing this for a while, and I look forward to seeing reparations be created that are beyond my wildest dreams, as they have been so far.
And I also think using an example, right? So if we look at the $15 minimum, and the $15 minimum was a thing, if I am an employee and I am making minimum wage and my minimum wage is $15, that means my supervisor has to make more. That means her supervisor has to make more. That means the CEO of the corporation has to make more, because my base pay dictates how much they pay, how much they make, right? Because like the baseline, if the GM of Burger King is making $15 an hour, and now they're saying that an assistant, a regular worker, a linesman, right, has to make $15 an hour, that means that GM gets the pay raise. So like, what is the detriment? Where is the harm? Like, how is it detrimental to give poor people money?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yes,
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you, panelists. My question is.
why don't you use mine?
Okay, thank you, Queen, I appreciate that. Good afternoon. My question is, at the top of this week, sitting President Biden gave an apology to Indigenous people. My specific question, because you guys are the brain trust, what do we need to do to get reparations at the national level? Because we're still paying Indigenous people reparations. The US government is still paying the state of Israel reparations. The US government is still paying Jewish people reparations. So I'd like to know what specifically we can do to help you guys in the community and what your strategies are. And thank you, everybody, and everybody be safe.
And I want you to first talk about there's an apology in the report, so I want you to reference that as well in answering this. But go ahead. Ken.
Sure, in the report, there was a request for apology. The mayor did apologize on Juneteenth, which was great, that he did that on behalf of the city's history of crimes that were committed against our community. But what can we do on the federal level? We have been pushing for Biden to enact a reparations commission by executive order. We cannot get a commission established legislatively. The rules of the Senate would suggest that we would need a 60-vote majority in the Senate. And there's no way we're going to get just one Republican to vote. So we know that it'll be filibustered out. So the only way for us to get redress on the federal level, to begin the process, is for an executive order by the president. Now, I led a strategy session a couple of weeks ago, brought about 30 organizations together. And we put together what we call a Voices for Reparations Preparatory Justice Action Guidebook. You go to reparationsunited.org, it's on the front page. We have 19 actions that we want to engage in between now and the inauguration. We're targeting the president, we're targeting the Congressional Black Caucus to influence the president, we're targeting the big 8 civil rights organizations that have been meeting with the president, and the Urban League is one.
Absolutely. Yes.
And in a friendly manner. All of this is in a friendly manner. And we're targeting Kamala Harris. We're stating that there's political will in this country for Reparations Commission. In 2019, there was a Huffington Post poll asking the question around, are you in favor or unopposed to Reparations Commission? In 2024, just recently, Liberation Ventures had a poll asked the same question. I took the data from both of those polls and looked at and analyzed what's been the change. And there's been an increase in every aspect, from whites, blacks, Republicans, and Democrats. Right now, only 47% of Republicans oppose a reparations commission. It was something like 23% or 77% 5 years ago. So we see there's a decrease of opposition and an increase in political will. The state level, 3 largest cities in America, their governors have signed reparations bills into law. Over 29 cities have reparations commissions attached to us. And we had 217, we had 88% of federal elected in Congress, in the last Congress, sign on to the House and Senate bill. 88% of the Democrats. Almost 9 out of 10. So we're telling the president that he would be acting in the way in which this government is moving, this country is moving. And he can ensure his legacy if he has to do this now. But it's up to us to do it. So as 19 actions, you can, we made it very simple. You just go to an action, we tell you how to engage that action, who's leading that action, if you want to call them, message them directly. And we provided sample letters as well as social media messaging. On the 12th of November, exactly 1 week after the election, we're having what we call National Reparations Actions Day. And on that day, we're going to be messaging across the country all 4 of these targets. And so we want you, again, go to reparationsunited.org and you'll see the Reparations Actions Guidebook.
Reparations
United.org.
And is that with an S on reparations or not?
With an S.
Okay, reparationsunited.org. I'm going to let that be the final word. We are at time. And let me just first ask you to thank our panelists for an engaging conversation. And then I want to thank all of you who had a role in the report. We are forever indebted to you as the Chicago Urban League, and I want to thank you for that. And then I want to thank not only Dr. Kimmel, I thanked him earlier. I want to thank Calmetta Coleman. Where's Calmetta? There she is. For her work and our external affairs. But I want to thank each and every one of you for coming to this convening. Thank those who are tuning in on Facebook. And this is a part of continuing work, not just of the league, but of the community. And I don't ever want folks to forget that. Lastly, I mentioned earlier, and I'll probably mention it a few more times in a whole lot of other conversations. We went to the Legacy Museum, and that museum is actually entitled From Slavery to Mass Incarceration. And what it really says is that all of this stuff is connected, right? And I don't ever want anybody to forget that from the time that someone was kidnapped in Africa to the time that somebody is convicted on 26 in California or at some other building, there is a nexus, there's a connection.
That's right.
And if we understand that connection, it, I think, should govern our actions. So thank you for allowing that to govern your actions to dismantle the institutions that are benefiting from slavery. And with that, I'll give you the rest of your afternoon.
How do they get a copy of your
How do you
report?
get a copy of the report? The report will be found at chiul.org. Thank you. Forgot about that. One